Hello. My capstone paper was on the international exotic pet trade. My name is Grace Lee. So I'm just going to start this off with a YouTube video. I watched it and it's about reptiles specifically, which is what my paper is pretty much about. And I think it was informational. So let me kind of tells you why it's important.
Look at this adorable little guy. You might think he'd be great to bring home, but actually, this critter is critically endangered. This is a 2-year-old spider tortoise native to Madagascar. If we don't take action, these tortoises will go extinct in the wild within our lifetime. And that's something you can help prevent by getting smart on the illegal pet trade. People purchase this tortoise and other animals you'll meet here at the zoo and have them shipped right to their front door. The pets you have in your home right now could have been illegally taken from the wild. It could be your bird, your fish, or your new frog. Exotic reptiles and amphibians, even a turtle you find in a local stream, are not low-maintenance pets. They require animal expertise, special care, housing, and a diet that the average person can't always provide. They can also carry disease that can make you or your animal sick. You can help stop the illegal pet trade by doing your research. If you want an exotic pet, check their conservation status. Make sure you buy from a reputable captive breeder. Learn about proper care before you decide to buy. If you find a critter in a stream or a pond, it's better to observe it and leave it in its natural habitat. And finally, spread the word. Make sure your friends and family know about illegal exotic pets and encourage responsible and sustainable pet ownership. Your choice makes a difference.
Okay. We need to finish that. How do I make it big again? There we go. Okay, so why reptiles? That video kind of explains it. I feel like when we see, like when you go to somebody's house and they're like, oh my God, I got this really cool pet. It's always a reptile. It's always a red-eared pond slider or some cool exotic frog or a cool exotic snake, or you go on YouTube and you can watch videos of people with all kinds of exotic pets. And so I chose reptiles because they're one of the most studied in the pet trade. There's everything is traded. Reptiles are one of the most studied though, so you can hear the most about them. And then they're also some of the worst invasive species that I personally have studied, not necessarily the worst invasive species. I just have personally studied both the red-eared pond slider and the Burmese python. And both are really horrible, horrible invasive species that were introduced from people who had them as pets and couldn't handle them anymore. And so they released them. And it all started from the pet trade. It all started from the fact that they were able to go and buy those at a store and then release it into the ecosystem. And I think they're underappreciated for their role in the ecosystem. None of us appreciate what a reptile does in the ecosystem, and they're just as important as everything else, as we know. So there's two things that I focused on with the exotic pet trade. There's all kinds of things we could focus on. I chose to focus on the loss of biodiversity and problems with animal welfare. So the loss of biodiversity happens two ways. Either they're removing the species from its original habitat, and they do this very aggressively. They remove the species. This has to do with the animal welfare, which I'll get into, but they just remove the species in a really inhumane way. And half the time they're losing limbs, they're losing tails, they're losing all kinds of things. They're stressed out, they're overwhelmed, they're not okay. But removing the species from its original habitat is going to set that species off, set the ecosystem that the species was from off, because every single species and every single individual is important to the ecosystem. The pet trade is such a big, large scale that they're actually taking so many from the ecosystem that it's detrimental to the biodiversity of the ecosystems. And then invasive species, which is what we talked about just a second ago, the Burmese python, the red-eared pond slider. So they'll get there from people releasing it, or maybe they get out during transportation. Somehow they get into the ecosystem that they're not supposed to be in, and they take over the entire ecosystem. They take over resources and the niche and the habitat and everything for the native species, and it's really detrimental to the ecosystem that they're introduced to. Next is animal welfare. So the 5 freedoms that I listed in my paper are not being upheld, which is the freedom to not be stressed, the freedom to not be in captivity, the freedom to be able to live life how they would normally live, um, the freedom to be not captive, not stressed, live normal life, and the freedom to be for some reason I can't think of the last two. I'll get those up so that I can remember the last two. Anyways, the animal welfare is at cost during transportation, storage, handling, intensive captive breeding, captivity, and premature mortality. So during transportation and storage, they're put into tiny little boxes this big, and for a big snake or even a little snake, it's not big enough. They need a lot of room. They need the whole wild, and they're getting this little, they're going from the wild to this little tiny um, container, and that comes with storage too, and then handling. Like I said, the tails are coming off, the limbs are falling off, they're going blind, they're getting all messed up from the handling. And then intensive captive breeding, so people get them and then want to breed them a lot because it's an exotic species and they can get a lot of money for it, so they're breeding it over and over and over and over again. And you can imagine how stressful it is for a woman to have babies. It's just as stressful for an animal. It's really stressful on their bodies, and it's not good for them to be over and over and over having babies. Um, and then in captivity, they're put in these little containers and they're used to being in the wild. It's just not right for them. And then premature mortality. So they're dying earlier than they're supposed to be dying because they're not being handled right. They're getting disease. They're getting hurt. They're stressed out. They're in the wrong environment. They don't have the right things in their habitat. They're not getting the right food. It's just, it leads to much more premature mortality. And as I personally believe, animal welfare should be maintained no matter what. Um, it's not worth an animal's life just for clout or money. And there's 350 million species being exploited through the international pet trade annually. So a lot of species. So CITES is the international treaty that kind of covers this, this problem. And it stands for the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. So it was actually based off of the IUCN, which is just conservation of nature in general, the International Conservation of Nature. And that wasn't specific enough to trading, to the international trade, and the international trade is such a big thing that they had to make something specific to it. There's 180 countries involved in it, and it protects more than 35,000 species. International Union of the Conservation of Nature. And then the problem with CITES is that it doesn't cover the illegal trading, and illegal pet trade, as we've learned in just this class, the illegal pet trade is a huge problem. It's with the elephant horns, the rhino horns and elephant tusks and that kind of stuff is all has to do with the pet trade, and it's all illegally done, and it makes a lot of money. And so they're not, of course they're going to choose to do it illegally if they're getting more benefit from doing it illegally and they're not getting enough repercussions for doing it illegally. So more than 25% of the pet trade is illegal, which is a lot when there's 350 million species being traded, and that's just what we have documented. So we have no idea illegally how many are being exploited and traded. And so a lot of these people are desperate for money and resources, and I personally believe that we should give them more incentive to do it right. We should give them incentive, we should give them safety, we should give them shelter, we should give them food, we should give them whatever they need, money, so they don't feel like they have to go and do it illegally and exploit these animals for their own good. And so overall, pet trade's a horrible thing. It's not being done ethically. We could trade species in some way ethically. I personally believe we shouldn't be taking them from the wild at all. That's where they belong. We do thankfully have a treaty in place, the CITES treaty, but it's not doing enough. We still have a huge problem. And then, so they need to be more firmly enforced, and there needs to be better incentive and reform in the treaty so that it makes people want to do it legally. The pet trade is the second leading cause in loss of biodiversity, and loss in biodiversity is the leading cause in extinction. So it is all leading to extinction, essentially. So that is my presentation. Thank you.